Death in the Advent Calendar, narrated by Connor from Velvet Clues. Welcome, dear listeners, to another mystery from the quiet village of St. Mary Mead, where even the most innocent traditions can harbour the darkest secrets. I'm Connor, and tonight I invite you to settle in with your favourite warm beverage as we follow the incomparable Miss Jane Marple through a case that transforms the joyful countdown to Christmas into something far more sinister. Before we begin, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. What's your favourite Christmas tradition? Does your community have special celebrations that bring neighbours together during the holiday season? Share your stories below, as I always enjoy reading how you connect with these tales of mystery and human nature. Now, let us journey to St. Mary Mead in the winter of 1952, where an Advent calendar is about to reveal something far more deadly than anyone expected. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The tradition begins with poisoned anticipation. The 1st of December arrived in St. Mary Mead with the crisp clarity that only early winter mornings can provide, the kind of day where frost patterns decorated every window like nature's own lace curtains, and breath formed small clouds in the cold air. Miss Jane Marple stood at her cottage window, observing the unusual activity in the village square, with the keen attention she habitually applied to any deviation from St. Mary Mead's normal rhythms. The Women's Institute was preparing for their beloved Living Advent calendar tradition, now entering its 11th year of bringing the community together throughout the December season. The concept had originated with Mrs. Dolly Bantry a decade earlier, inspired by a similar tradition she'd witnessed during travels in Germany. Rather than the conventional paper advent calendars with their small chocolate treats or pictures behind numbered doors, St. Mary Mead's version involved actual households throughout the village. Each evening from December 1st through December 24th, a different home would open their main window, reveal an elaborate Christmas scene visible from the street, and host a brief gathering where neighbours could enjoy seasonal refreshments and fellowship before continuing their evening routines. Miss Marple had participated in the tradition since its inception, contributing her own window display on December 8th for the past several years. She found the custom charming in its simplicity and valuable in its ability to maintain community bonds during the increasingly busy modern era when neighbours seemed to have less time for one another than in previous generations. The Advent calendar provided structured opportunities for connection, ensuring that even the most solitary villagers encountered friendly faces and warm conversation at least once during the holiday season. This particular December promised to be especially elaborate, as Miss Marple had learned from the printed schedule that Mrs. Bantry had distributed at the November Women's Institute meeting. The calendar would culminate on December 20th with a celebration at Blackwood Manor, hosted by Gerald Blackwood himself. This development had surprised many villagers, as Blackwood was not known for generosity or community spirit. His participation seemed uncharacteristic, though Miss Marple suspected that social pressure and business considerations, rather than genuine holiday cheer, had motivated his involvement. Gerald Blackwood had lived at Blackwood Manor for nearly 40 years, having inherited the substantial property upon his father's death in 1915. He had built a considerable fortune through banking and property investments, though his business practices were widely regarded as ruthless, even by the standards of competitive commerce. Miss Marple had observed over the years that Blackwood inspired more fear than respect among St. Mary Mead's residents, and his rare appearances at village functions created awkward silences rather than warm greetings. The morning's activity in the square centred around the installation of the large wooden advent calendar framework that would track the progression through December. Young Raymond West, Miss Marple's nephew, had designed an elegant structure featuring 24 numbered panels arranged in the shape of a Christmas tree. Each evening, after the designated household had hosted their celebration, a volunteer would illuminate the corresponding number on the framework, creating a visual representation of the countdown to Christmas that grew more complete with each passing day. Miss Marple watched as several members of the Women's Institute struggled with the framework's assembly, their efforts hampered by cold fingers and the awkward weight of the wooden structure. She noted with approval when Dr. Haydock arrived to offer assistance, his practical medical hands proving useful for tasks beyond diagnosis and treatment. The doctor's participation reminded her of how deeply interwoven the Advent tradition had become with village life, drawing together people from every social stratum and occupation. By mid-morning, the framework stood complete in the square's centre, its fresh paint gleaming in the winter sunlight, and its numbered panels waiting for the illumination that would mark each successful celebration. Miss Marple decided a walk to inspect the installation more closely would provide beneficial exercise and opportunity to gather information about the December schedule's details. She bundled herself appropriately against the cold and made her way through streets where other residents were emerging to admire the Advent calendar framework and discuss their anticipation for the evening's first celebration. At the square, she encountered Mrs. Bantry supervising final adjustments to the framework's positioning, her usual energy undimmed by the morning's cold. The two friends exchanged greetings, and Miss Marple accepted the printed schedule that detailed which household would host each date's celebration, along with the theme each family had chosen for their window display and the refreshments they planned to serve. "I do hope this year proceeds more smoothly than last December," Mrs. Bantry remarked, adjusting her scarf against a sudden gust of wind. "Do you remember the unfortunate incident on December 15th, when the Johnsons' display caught fire from the candles? Quite dramatic, though thankfully no serious damage occurred." Miss Marple nodded, recalling how quick action by several neighbours had prevented what might have been a disaster. Perhaps the Women's Institute might issue gentle reminders about fire safety, particularly for displays involving open flames or electrical lighting. The desire for authenticity and beauty should not override practical caution. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Thomas Reed, the event coordinator whom the Women's Institute had hired to assist with the more elaborate celebrations scheduled for December's final week. Reed was a young man of perhaps 30 years, with the organised manner and detailed notebooks that characterised professional event planners. He had relocated to St. Mary Mead earlier that year, establishing a small business coordinating weddings, parties, and community celebrations for clients throughout the surrounding villages. "Mrs. Bantry, Miss Marple," Reed greeted them with professional courtesy. "I wanted to confirm the arrangements for December 20th at Blackwood Manor. Mr. Blackwood has requested several modifications to the original plan, and I need approval from the Women's Institute before proceeding with these changes." Mrs. Bantry's expression suggested she found Blackwood's modifications less than welcome. "What sort of changes, Mr. Reed? The schedule was finalised in October, and making alterations at this late date creates complications for everyone involved." Reed consulted his notebook with evident discomfort. "Mr. Blackwood insists on providing all refreshments himself, rather than accepting the catering services that Sarah Fletcher was contracted to supply. He claims his cook can prepare superior offerings, and that outside catering would be inappropriate for a celebration at Blackwood Manor. He's also demanded exclusive control over the window display, refusing the decorating assistance that volunteers typically provide." Miss Marple observed this exchange with growing interest. Blackwood's insistence on complete control seemed consistent with his general character, yet something about the specific nature of his demands troubled her in ways she could not immediately articulate. The Advent calendar tradition relied upon community participation and shared responsibility, values that Blackwood had never demonstrated in any aspect of his life. His sudden embrace of the celebration, while simultaneously rejecting its collaborative spirit, suggested motivations beyond simple holiday. Enthusiasm. "I suppose we must accommodate Mr. Blackwood's preferences," Mrs. Bantry said reluctantly, "though I shall inform Sarah Fletcher personally about this change, as she's already purchased ingredients for the catering she expected to provide. Most inconsiderate of Mr. Blackwood to alter arrangements without proper notice." As Reed departed to convey the Women's Institute's acceptance of Blackwood's modifications, Miss Marple found herself studying the printed schedule with particular attention to December 20th's entry. The brief description indicated that Blackwood planned to display an elaborate nativity scene in his main drawing-room window, with handmade chocolates and mulled wine as refreshments for the expected crowd of villagers. The choice of homemade chocolates struck her as curious, as Blackwood had never been known for culinary interests or domestic skills. The remainder of the day passed in pleasant anticipation of the evening's first Advent celebration, scheduled at the Larkin household on the village's eastern edge. Miss Marple prepared herself for the short walk, noting with satisfaction that the weather remained clear and cold, ideal conditions for the outdoor gathering that would precede entry to view the Larkins window display. The tradition specified that celebrations should begin at 7 o'clock each evening, allowing working residents time to return home and families to finish their suppers before joining the community gathering. By 6:45, Miss Marple had joined the stream of villagers making their way through lamplit streets toward the Larkin residence. The sense of shared anticipation reminded her of childhood Christmas preparations, when the entire season had seemed infused with magic and possibility. Even as an elderly woman long past such innocent wonder, she found the Advent calendar tradition restored some measure of that earlier enchantment, proving that community connection could generate its own form of magic, regardless of one's age or circumstances. The Larkins had chosen angels as their theme, and their drawing room window revealed an elaborate scene featuring handcrafted angels suspended at various heights, creating the illusion of heavenly hosts descending toward a small manger scene positioned at the window's base. Soft lighting from behind cast gentle shadows that made the angels appear to move slightly in the flickering candlelight, while recorded choir music drifted through a speaker positioned near the front door. The effect was both beautiful and reverent, setting an appropriately spiritual tone for the Advent season's beginning. Inside, the Larkins served traditional mince pies and hot cider, their modest home filled beyond comfortable capacity with neighbours who had turned out to support the tradition's opening celebration. Miss Marple accepted refreshments and found herself in conversation with several acquaintances, including Dr. Haydock, who had attended despite the late hour. Following a full day of medical appointments. Excellent turnout for the first evening, the doctor observed, balancing a mince pie on a small plate while managing his cider cup with practiced coordination. I confess I wondered whether the tradition's novelty might have diminished after 10 years, but the community's enthusiasm appears undiminished. Miss Marple agreed, though she noted that certain faces were conspicuously absent from the gathering. Gerald Blackwood had not attended, which surprised no one, as he rarely participated in village functions unless his own interests were directly served. More interesting was the absence of Dorothy Mills, Blackwood's longtime housekeeper, who typically attended most Women's Institute events and had been a regular presence at previous Advent celebrations. As the evening concluded and villagers began their homeward journeys through cold December darkness, Miss Marple found herself thinking about the approaching celebration at Blackwood Manor on December 20th. Something about the arrangement troubled her, though she could not identify the specific source of her unease. Perhaps it was simply Blackwood's uncharacteristic participation, or perhaps some deeper instinct warned her that the Advent calendar's innocent tradition was about to be corrupted by forces that had nothing to do with Christmas spirit or community fellowship. The illumination of the first numbered panel on the Advent framework in the village square marked the official beginning of St. Mary Mead's countdown to Christmas. As Miss Marple watched the number 1 glow softly in the winter darkness, she reflected that Advent calendars were designed to build anticipation, revealing small surprises that accumulated toward the greater celebration of Christmas Day. What she could not yet know was that this particular Advent calendar would build toward a revelation far darker than anyone anticipated, and that December 20th's window would reveal not joy, but death, transforming the innocent countdown into something that would haunt St. Mary Mead long after the holiday decorations had been packed away and the framework dismantled for another year. Chapter 2. Chocolates prepared in suspicious isolation. The days of December proceeded with the measured pace that characterized St. Mary Mead's quieter seasons, each evening bringing another Advent celebration that drew the community together in brief fellowship before winter darkness sent everyone homeward to their firesides. Miss Marple attended each gathering faithfully, observing with pleasure how the tradition maintained its ability to generate genuine warmth and connection among neighbours who might otherwise exchange only hurried greetings in the course of their busy modern lives. By December 15th, the village square's Advent framework displayed a growing constellation of illuminated numbers, creating a visual representation of the steady progression toward Christmas that pleased everyone who passed through the square on daily errands. The celebrations had varied in elaboration and theme, from simple nativity scenes to elaborate winter wonderlands. but each household had contributed their unique interpretation of Christmas spirit and their offerings of refreshment and hospitality to the gathered villagers. Miss Marple had hosted her own celebration on December 8th, displaying her collection of antique Christmas cards in her drawing-room window, arranged to tell the story of how holiday greetings had evolved over the past century. She had served her famous ginger biscuits and mulled cider, recipes that had been passed down through 3 generations of her family. The evening had proceeded pleasantly, with perhaps 40 neighbours crowding into her small cottage to view the display and enjoy refreshments, while sharing memories of Christmases past. It was on the morning of December 16th, while taking her customary walk through the village to purchase fresh bread from the bakery, that Miss Marple encountered the first indication that something unusual was occurring at Blackwood Manor. She had paused outside the post office to exchange greetings with Mrs. Pierce, the postmistress, when Dorothy Mills emerged from the building carrying several parcels wrapped in brown paper and secured with excessive amounts of string. The housekeeper's appearance startled Miss Marple, as Mills looked distinctly unwell. Her usually neat grey hair showed signs of disarray beneath her sensible hat. Her complexion appeared unnaturally pale, and her movements suggested a woman labouring under considerable strain. Most notably, Mills seemed to be avoiding eye contact with other villagers, hurrying past neighbours who attempted to greet her with only the briefest acknowledgement of their friendly overtures. "Poor Dorothy looks quite peaked," Mrs. Pierce observed, after Mills had disappeared around the corner toward the road leading to Blackwood Manor. I asked whether she was feeling well, but she barely responded before rushing away, most unlike her usual manner, which is always so pleasant and cordial. Miss Marple filed this observation away for future consideration, noting that Mills's distress coincided with the approaching celebration at Blackwood Manor. She inquired casually whether Mrs. Pierce knew the contents of the parcels Mills had collected, aware that postmistresses generally possessed comprehensive knowledge of their customers' correspondence and shipments. "Deliveries from London," Mrs. Pierce confirmed, consulting the records she maintained with meticulous attention to detail. 3 parcels arrived for Mr. Blackwood over the past week, all from shops in Mayfair and Knightsbridge. Expensive establishments, judging by the addresses. The parcels felt quite heavy, and I noticed one was marked fragile, suggesting glassware, or perhaps fancy dishware. This information intrigued Miss Marple, as it suggested Blackwood was indeed making special preparations for the December 20th celebration. Yet something about the timing and the housekeeper's obvious distress created a discordant note that troubled her experienced instincts. She thanked Mrs. Pierce for the information and continued her walk, her mind turning over the various elements of the situation that seemed somehow inconsistent with the simple hosting of an Advent calendar celebration. That afternoon, Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor in the person of Thomas Reed, the event coordinator, who appeared at her cottage door with his ever-present notebook and an expression of considerable frustration. She invited him inside for tea, sensing that he needed to unburden himself about whatever difficulties had prompted this call. "I apologise for arriving without notice, Miss Marple," Reed began, once they were settled in her comfortable sitting room with cups of properly brewed tea. "I'm at my wits' end regarding the arrangements for December 20th, and I understand you're known for your sensible advice on delicate matters involving village personalities." Miss Marple smiled gently, recognising that her reputation for resolving complicated situations had apparently spread beyond her immediate circle of acquaintances. "I'm happy to listen, Mr. Reed, though I cannot promise solutions to difficulties I don't yet understand. Please tell me what's troubling you about the Blackwood Manor celebration." Reed consulted his notebook, though Miss Marple suspected he knew the details by heart, and the gesture served merely to organise his thoughts. "Mr. Blackwood has become increasingly difficult about every aspect of the celebration. He's rejected all offers of assistance from the Women's Institute volunteers, insisted on preparing all refreshments himself, despite having no experience in such matters, and refused to allow anyone, including myself as the hired coordinator, to view his window display before the actual celebration." "That does seem rather extreme," Miss Marple observed, adding more sugar to Reed's tea with the understanding that sweetness often helped soothe agitated nerves. "Has Mr. Blackwood explained his reasons for this unusual insistence on complete control?" "He claims the celebration must reflect Blackwood Manor's standards of excellence, and that outside assistance would compromise the event's quality," Reed replied, his tone suggesting he found this explanation less than convincing. More concerning is his treatment of Dorothy Mills, his housekeeper. I've visited the manor 3 times this past week to discuss final arrangements, and each time I've observed Mrs. Mills appearing increasingly distressed and exhausted. This confirmation of Miss Marple's own observations heightened her concern considerably. "Did you have opportunity to speak with Mrs. Mills about her well-being?" Reed shook his head. "Mr. Blackwood ensures she's never present when I'm there for our meetings. He always sends her on errands or assigns tasks that take her to distant parts of the manor. The one time I encountered her in the hallway, she looked as though she might collapse from exhaustion, and when I expressed concern, she simply shook her head and hurried away, before Mr. Blackwood could notice we were speaking." Miss Marple considered this information carefully, recognizing patterns that suggested something significantly troubling was occurring at Blackwood Manor beyond simple celebration preparations. "Mr. Reed, in your professional opinion, what do you believe is actually happening regarding these advent calendar arrangements?" The young man hesitated, clearly wrestling with the professional obligation to respect client confidentiality and his genuine concern for what he had observed. "I believe Mr. Blackwood is using the celebration as an opportunity to demonstrate his wealth and superiority over the rest of the village. The elaborate preparations, the expensive parcels from London, the insistence on complete control, it all suggests someone trying to prove they're above the community rather than part of it." "A reasonable interpretation," Miss Marple agreed, though her own instincts suggested layers of complication beyond simple arrogance. "And what of the refreshments Mr. Blackwood plans to serve? Do you know what he's preparing?" "Handmade chocolates," Reed confirmed, consulting his notes. "He's been quite specific about that point. He claims to be making traditional peppermint creams using a family recipe, along with purchasing expensive truffles from a London chocolatier for the guests. Apparently, he's been working on the peppermint creams for days, refusing any assistance and keeping them locked away in his private study." The image of Gerald Blackwood labouring over homemade chocolates struck Miss Marple as profoundly incongruous with everything she knew about the man's character and habits. Blackwood had never demonstrated interest in domestic activities or culinary pursuits. His sudden dedication to chocolate making seemed as improbable as discovering him taking up needlework or flower arranging. After Reed departed, Miss Marple sat for some time in contemplation, her knitting lying neglected in her lap as she considered the various troubling elements that were accumulating around the December 20th celebration. The Advent calendar tradition was meant to be joyful and inclusive, bringing the community together in shared anticipation of Christmas. Blackwood's approach seemed designed to achieve the opposite effect, creating division and demonstrating superiority rather than fellowship. More troubling still was the situation with Dorothy Mills. The housekeeper's distress could not be dismissed as simple overwork or holiday stress. Miss Marple had known Mills for many years and had always found her to be capable, resilient, and remarkably even-tempered, despite the difficulties of serving Gerald Blackwood's demanding household. Whatever was causing Mills's current state must be significant indeed to produce such visible deterioration in her usually steady demeanour. The following day, December 17th, Miss Marple made a decision that would have horrified her more conventional acquaintances. She walked to Blackwood Manor under the pretext of delivering a basket of preserves she had prepared as a thank you gift for Mills's assistance with a Women's Institute project earlier in the year. This excuse was thin at best, as Miss Marple rarely made personal visits to Blackwood Manor and had numerous more convenient opportunities to deliver such gifts. However, it provided sufficient justification for her appearance should anyone question her presence. The manor's approach was impressive even in winter's bare season, with ancient oak trees lining the drive and well-maintained grounds extending in all directions. The house itself was a substantial Georgian structure that had been in the Blackwood family for several generations, its stone facade speaking of wealth and permanence that money alone could not quickly establish. Miss Marple noted that Christmas decorations adorned the exterior with more elaboration than she had observed in previous years, suggesting that Blackwood was indeed making special efforts for the upcoming celebration. Her knock at the front door was answered not by Mills, as she had expected, but by Blackwood himself, an unusual circumstance that immediately heightened her attention. He appeared surprised to see her, though he maintained the veneer of courtesy that society demanded, even from those who felt no genuine warmth toward their visitors. "Miss Marple," he greeted her with formal correctness. "This is unexpected. I'm afraid I'm quite busy with preparations for Saturday's celebration and cannot spare time for social calls." "I quite understand, Mr. Blackwood," Miss Marple replied, with her most disarming smile. "I merely wish to deliver these preserves to Mrs. Mills as a small thank you for her help with the Women's Institute charitable auction. If you could pass them along to her, I'll not take any more of your valuable time." Blackwood accepted the basket with evident impatience. "Mrs. Mills is currently engaged with tasks that cannot be interrupted. I shall ensure she receives your gift when her duties permit." He began to close the door, clearly eager to end the encounter. "Of course," Miss Marple said pleasantly, though she had noticed several significant details during the brief exchange. Blackwood's hands showed stains that appeared to be chocolate, confirming that he was indeed personally involved in preparing the promised peppermint creams. More interesting was the faint chemical odour she had detected from the interior of the house, something that seemed inconsistent with chocolate making, but familiar in a way she could not immediately place. As she walked back toward the village, Miss Marple reflected on what she had observed and what it might signify. The puzzle remained frustratingly disconnected, but her years of experience with human nature suggested that something was profoundly wrong at Blackwood Manor. The Advent calendar celebration that should have been a joyful community gathering was being transformed into something else entirely, though whether that transformation represented simple arrogance or something far more sinister remained to be determined. Chapter 3. Window decorations concealing darker preparations. The 18th of December dawned grey and cold, with low clouds threatening snow that would either enhance the approaching celebration's festive atmosphere or create travel difficulties for villagers attempting to attend the evening's scheduled gathering at the Winthrop farm. Miss Marple observed these meteorological developments with mild concern, though her primary attention remained focused on the increasingly troubling situation surrounding December 20th's celebration at Blackwood Manor. She had spent the previous evening reviewing what she knew about Gerald Blackwood's history, drawing upon decades of village observation and the information network that elderly ladies who paid careful attention inevitably accumulated. The picture that emerged was profoundly unpleasant, revealing a man whose wealth had been built upon ruthlessness and whose personal relationships were characterized by cruelty and exploitation rather than genuine human connection. Most troubling was the information she had gathered through discreet inquiries about Blackwood's relationship with Dorothy Mills. The housekeeper had entered his service 32 years earlier, shortly after her husband's death, in what had been officially ruled an accidental fall down the stairs at a warehouse where he had worked as Gerald Blackwood's business partner. Miss Marple had discovered, through careful questioning of older villagers who remembered the incident, that there had been considerable speculation at the time about whether the fall had truly been accidental. According to Mrs. Trimble, who had been friendly with Mills during that difficult period, witnesses had reported hearing a violent argument between Blackwood and Mills's husband immediately before the fatal fall. The police investigation had been perfunctory, influenced by Blackwood's wealth and social position, and the death had been attributed to accidental causes, despite circumstantial evidence suggesting a more sinister explanation. Mills had been left widowed and penniless, eventually forced to accept employment as housekeeper to the very man she believed had murdered her husband. This revelation cast Mills's 32 years of service to Blackwood in an entirely new and tragic light. Miss Marple understood that poverty and limited options sometimes forced people into situations that more fortunate individuals would find intolerable. Yet she could barely imagine the psychological torment of spending 3 decades serving someone you believed had destroyed your life and escaped justice through wealth and influence. The Morning Post brought an unexpected communication from Raymond West, Miss Marple's nephew, who had sent a lengthy letter discussing his research into Victorian poisoning cases for a novel he was writing. Raymond, a successful author of detective fiction, often corresponded with his aunt about criminal matters, valuing her insights into human psychology and her encyclopedic knowledge of village life's darker undercurrents. The letter included detailed information about thallium poisoning, which Raymond described as a favourite method among Victorian murderers due to its delayed symptoms and difficulty of detection before modern toxicology methods were developed. He noted that thallium sulfate had been commonly available in rat poisons until being banned in most countries during the mid-20th century, though old stock still existed in storage areas and garden sheds throughout England. Miss Marple read this information with growing unease, her mind immediately connecting Raymond's academic discussion of thallium poisoning to the chemical odour she had detected at Blackwood Manor during her visit the previous day. Thallium compounds often produce distinctive odours, and the substance's historical use in rat poisons meant that old country houses like Blackwood Manor might well have vintage supplies stored in forgotten corners of their extensive outbuildings. The coincidence seemed too specific to dismiss, particularly given Dorothy Mills's obvious distress and the unusual circumstances surrounding Blackwood's chocolate-making activities. Miss Marple found herself contemplating possibilities that would have seemed absurd in the context of a cheerful Advent calendar celebration, yet which aligned disturbingly well with what she knew about human nature's capacity for long-delayed revenge. That afternoon she received an unexpected visit from Sarah Fletcher, the caterer who had been displaced when Blackwood insisted on providing all refreshments himself for the December 20th celebration. Fletcher was a capable woman in her mid-40s who had built a successful small business, despite the various obstacles that confronted women attempting to establish commercial enterprises in the conservative social environment of rural England. "Miss Marple," Fletcher began after the usual courtesies had been observed and tea had been poured, "I hope you'll forgive my presumption in calling without invitation, but I need to speak with someone sensible about a rather troubling matter involving Mr. Blackwood and the upcoming Advent celebration." Miss Marple encouraged her to continue, sensing that Fletcher's concern might provide additional pieces to the puzzle she was attempting to assemble. The caterer's next words confirmed her instincts. "3 years ago, I catered a garden party at Blackwood Manor for a business association Mr. Blackwood belonged to," Fletcher explained, her usually steady voice betraying underlying distress. "The event proceeded normally until several guests became severely ill with what was eventually diagnosed as food poisoning. The health authorities investigated and determined that my food had been contaminated with bacteria, though I maintained then and still maintain now that my preparation methods were entirely sanitary and my ingredients were fresh and properly stored." "You believe someone deliberately contaminated the food," Miss Marple said gently, understanding where this narrative was leading. Fletcher nodded emphatically. "I'm certain of it, and I believe that someone was Gerald Blackwood himself. He had access to the serving area before guests arrived, and I later discovered he had been overheard discussing how useful it would be to ruin my business reputation so he could purchase my commercial kitchen property at a reduced price. The scandal destroyed my catering business almost overnight. I spent 2 years rebuilding my reputation and establishing credibility again, and only recently began receiving contracts for significant events. And now Mr. Blackwood has dismissed your catering services for the Advent celebration," Miss Marple observed, "which must feel like a particularly cruel reminder of that earlier incident." "Exactly," Fletcher confirmed. "When Thomas Reed informed me that Mr. Blackwood insisted on providing all refreshments himself, my first reaction was relief that I wouldn't have to work for the man who had deliberately destroyed my business. But then I began wondering why he would suddenly want to prepare food for a community gathering when he's never shown the slightest interest in such activities before." This question had been troubling Miss Marple as well, and Fletcher's perspective provided additional context that made Blackwood's behaviour seem even more suspicious. "Mrs. Fletcher, in your professional opinion, what would be required to prepare handmade peppermint cream chocolates in sufficient quantity to serve as refreshments for a gathering of perhaps 60 or 70 villagers?" Fletcher considered this carefully. "The process itself isn't terribly complicated, though it requires patience and attention to detail. The more significant consideration would be the quantity. To provide adequate refreshments for 60 or 70 people, one would need to prepare at least 10 to 12 dozen chocolates, which would require considerable time and effort for someone without professional experience or equipment. And if someone were preparing chocolates for guests while also making a separate, smaller batch for personal consumption," Miss Marple continued thoughtfully, "would it be difficult to keep the 2 batches distinct and prevent confusion between them?" "Not if one used different containers or marked them clearly," Fletcher replied. "In fact, any competent cook would naturally separate different batches to avoid exactly that sort of confusion, particularly if the batches were intended for different purposes." After Fletcher departed, Miss Marple sat in quiet contemplation of the various elements that were accumulating into an increasingly disturbing pattern. A man with a history of cruelty and exploitation was preparing chocolates in isolation for a community celebration, while his housekeeper, who had spent 32 years serving the man she believed had murdered her husband, displayed signs of severe emotional distress. The chemical odour at Blackwood Manor suggested the presence of substances that had no legitimate connection to chocolate making, while the man's insistence on complete control and refusal of all assistance created the perfect conditions for unobserved activity. The following day, December 19th, brought the final piece of information that transformed Miss Marple's growing suspicions into genuine alarm. Dr. Haydock, making his rounds through the village, stopped at her cottage to return a medical journal she had lent him the previous week. Their conversation turned naturally to the upcoming celebration at Blackwood Manor, and the doctor mentioned a curious incident that had occurred that morning. "Dorothy Mills called my surgery requesting information about thallium poisoning symptoms," Haydock reported, with evident puzzlement. She claimed Mr. Blackwood had discovered vintage rat poison in one of the manor's outbuildings and wanted to know what signs to watch for if someone had been accidentally exposed. The call struck me as odd, as Mills has been managing that household for 3 decades and would surely know to dispose of hazardous materials rather than seek medical information about exposure symptoms. Miss Marple felt her pulse quicken as this information connected with everything else she had observed and learned over the past week. Did Mrs. Mills mention how much of this rat poison Mr. Blackwood had discovered, or whether any of it appeared to be missing from the original container? She did, actually, Haydock confirmed. She said the container was an old tin from the 1940s or early 1950s, still bearing the original label indicating thallium sulfate as the active ingredient. According to Mills, the tin appeared to be only half full, though there was no way to determine whether it had always been partially filled or whether some portion had been removed at some point over the past several decades. The implications were clear and profoundly troubling. Miss Marple made an immediate decision that she recognised might seem melodramatic if her suspicions proved unfounded, but which she felt was absolutely necessary given the pattern of evidence that had accumulated. She asked Dr. Haydock to remain for a more extended conversation and proceeded to share her observations and concerns about the situation at Blackwood Manor. The doctor listened with increasing seriousness, his medical training making him particularly attentive to the details about thallium poisoning and its potential use in the context of deliberately contaminated food. When Miss Marple finished her summary, Haydock sat in thoughtful silence for several moments before responding. "If you're correct in your suspicions," he said finally, "then we're looking at a premeditated murder plot being carried out under the guise of a community Christmas celebration. The question is whether we have sufficient evidence to justify intervention before tomorrow evening's gathering, or whether we risk making serious accusations based on circumstantial observations and speculation." Miss Marple had considered this dilemma throughout the previous night. "I believe we must speak with Inspector Slack immediately, even if my suspicions prove unfounded and we appear foolish for raising alarm unnecessarily. The potential consequences of remaining silent are too grave to risk. An entire community gathering could be exposed to poisoned refreshments, or at minimum, one specific individual may be targeted for murder, using methods that would be almost impossible to trace without prior knowledge of what to look for." They agreed to visit the police station together that afternoon, presenting their concerns to Inspector Slack in the hope that official authority might be able to investigate more thoroughly than elderly ladies and village doctors could manage, through observation and deduction alone. As Miss Marple prepared for this conversation, she reflected that the Advent calendar tradition, meant to count down to Christmas with joy and anticipation, was about to reveal something far darker than anyone had intended when they first illuminated that framework in the village square 19 days earlier. Chapter 4. 5 Suspects with Access and Motive. Inspector Slack's initial reaction to Miss Marple's concerns about the December 20th celebration ranged somewhere between skepticism and outright dismissal, though Dr. Haydock's corroboration of certain medical details lent sufficient credibility to prevent the inspector from rejecting their warnings entirely. The three sat in Slack's modest office at the village police station while rain began to fall outside, adding atmospheric weight to the conversation's serious nature. "Let me understand your position clearly," Slack said, with the careful patience of someone addressing elderly relatives whose mental faculties might be declining. You believe Gerald Blackwood is planning to poison himself during tomorrow's Advent calendar celebration using chocolates he's been preparing in isolation, or alternatively, that his housekeeper Dorothy Mills is planning to poison him using the same chocolates. Have I summarised your theory accurately? Miss Marple maintained her composure despite the inspector's patronising tone. Not precisely, Inspector. What I'm suggesting is that the circumstances surrounding tomorrow's celebration include several elements that, when considered together, indicate potential danger. Whether that danger stems from Blackwood's own actions or someone else's remains to be determined through proper investigation. Dr. Haydock interjected, with the authority his medical position commanded. Inspector, the specific details about thallium poisoning cannot be dismissed as mere coincidence. The presence of vintage rat poison containing thallium sulfate at Blackwood Manor, combined with Mills's inquiry about exposure symptoms, suggests at minimum that someone in that household is contemplating the substance's potential effects on human health. Slack grudgingly acknowledged this point, though his expression remained unconvinced. Very well. Suppose I accept that something irregular may be occurring at Blackwood Manor. What specific action do you propose I take? I can hardly arrest someone for making homemade chocolates or for inquiring about poison symptoms in the context of hazardous material disposal. This was precisely the difficulty Miss Marple had anticipated. The evidence was suggestive rather than conclusive, creating a situation where intervention might prevent tragedy, but could equally result in embarrassment if the suspicions proved unfounded. She had spent considerable time the previous evening considering how to address this dilemma. I propose that you conduct a thorough investigation into who has had access to Blackwood Manor's kitchen during the past week, Miss Marple suggested. Identify everyone who might have had opportunity to tamper with food preparation and examine their potential motives for wishing harm to Gerald Blackwood. If the investigation reveals nothing suspicious, then tomorrow's celebration can proceed normally, and we shall all have learned a valuable lesson about not allowing our imaginations to create danger where none exists. Slack considered this proposal with visible reluctance, clearly weighing his professional obligation to investigate credible threats against his equally strong desire to avoid appearing foolish by pursuing what might prove to be baseless speculation. Finally, with evident resignation, he agreed to conduct preliminary inquiries that afternoon. I'll visit Blackwood Manor under the pretext of reviewing safety arrangements for tomorrow's gathering, he decided. While there, I'll observe the situation firsthand and make discreet inquiries about who has had access to the kitchen and food preparation areas. If I discover anything genuinely concerning, I'll take appropriate action. If not, we'll consider the matter closed and speak no more about poisoned chocolates and Advent calendar murders. Miss Marple accepted this compromise, recognizing it represented the maximum intervention she could reasonably expect, given the circumstantial nature of her concerns. After leaving the police station, she and Dr. Haydock discussed their next steps, agreeing that they should gather as much information as possible about potential suspects before Inspector Slack's investigation potentially closed off access to witnesses. Their inquiries over the remainder of December 19th revealed a troubling roster of individuals who had both access to Blackwood Manor's kitchen and powerful motives for wishing Gerald Blackwood harm. The list, when complete, included 5 names, each representing a life that Blackwood had damaged or destroyed through his decades of ruthless business practices and personal cruelty. Dorothy Mills headed the list for obvious reasons. Her 32 years of service to the man she believed had murdered her husband created a motive of almost incomprehensible power, sustained revenge delayed across 3 decades until opportunity and means finally aligned. Miss Marple learned from discreet inquiries that Mills had been in the manor's kitchen daily during the past week, with unrestricted access to food preparation areas and intimate knowledge of Blackwood's habits and preferences. Thomas Reed, the event coordinator, represented a less obvious but equally compelling suspect. Miss Marple discovered through Mrs. Bantry that Reed's family had owned a prosperous farm on the outskirts of St. Mary Mead until 5 years earlier, when Blackwood's bank had foreclosed on their property despite the family making regular payments according to the mortgage terms. Investigation by Reed's father had revealed that Blackwood had deliberately falsified bank records to show missed payments, creating grounds for foreclosure that allowed him to purchase the valuable property at auction for a fraction of its worth. The farm had been in the Reed family for 4 generations, and its loss had devastated Thomas's parents, contributing to his father's fatal heart attack 2 years later. Reed had been at Blackwood Manor multiple times during the past week, coordinating celebration arrangements and having access to kitchen areas during his visits. Sarah Fletcher's motive stemmed from the deliberate destruction of her catering business 3 years earlier, an act of calculated cruelty that had nearly bankrupted her and required years of effort to rebuild her professional reputation. Though Blackwood had dismissed her catering services for the Advent celebration, Fletcher had visited the manor on December 17th to retrieve serving dishes she had stored there from a previous event, giving her access to the kitchen during the crucial period when chocolates were being prepared. Harold Price emerged as another suspect through information Miss Marple gathered from the village photographer's assistant. Price's daughter Eleanor had been engaged to Blackwood's son Robert until Gerald had systematically destroyed the relationship through lies and manipulation, convinced that Eleanor's middle-class background made her unsuitable for a Blackwood alliance. The broken engagement had devastated Eleanor, leading to a suicide attempt that left her permanently emotionally fragile. Price had been at Blackwood Manor on December 16th, photographing the house's elaborate Christmas. Decorations for the village newsletter, with access to kitchen areas while seeking the best angles for his photographs. Finally, Catherine Blackwood, Gerald's estranged sister, had visited the manor on December 18th to demand her rightful portion of their father's estate. According to village gossip, Gerald had systematically cheated Catherine of her inheritance through forged documents and fraudulent claims when their father died in 1915, leaving her with nothing while he retained the manor and the substantial fortune. Catherine lived modestly in a cottage on the village's outskirts, supported by teaching piano lessons, her reduced circumstances a constant reminder of her brother's betrayal. Her visit to the manor had been brief but stormy, with raised voices audible to gardeners working on the grounds, and she had passed through the kitchen while leaving, creating opportunity for access to food preparation areas. Each suspect possessed powerful motive and proven opportunity, creating exactly the sort of complicated investigation that Inspector Slack found most frustrating. Miss Marple recognized that identifying the would-be poisoner from among these 5 candidates would require careful analysis of not merely motive and opportunity, but also specific knowledge and capability. Thallium poisoning demanded certain technical understanding about dosage, preparation, and delivery methods that not everyone would possess. That evening, as Miss Marple reviewed her notes by lamplight in her cottage's comfortable sitting room, she found herself thinking about the nature of revenge and the terrible patience it sometimes required. Someone among those 5 suspects had waited years for the right moment to strike, accumulating grievance upon grievance while maintaining the facade of normal life until circumstances aligned perfectly. The Advent calendar celebration provided ideal cover, a community gathering where poisoned chocolates would seem merely a tragic accident, or at worst a mystery with multiple suspects and limited evidence. The rain continued through the night, creating the sort of grey, damp December atmosphere that made everyone grateful for warm fires and hot tea. Miss Marple slept poorly, her mind turning over the various possibilities, and considering what might transpire the following evening at Blackwood Manor. The Advent calendar tradition was meant to build anticipation for Christmas, revealing daily surprises that accumulated toward the greater celebration. Tomorrow's revelation would indeed be surprising, though not in the joyful way that the Women's Institute had intended when they established the tradition a decade earlier. As December 20th dawned cold and clear, Miss Marple prepared herself for what she suspected would be one of the most significant and troubling days in St. Mary Mead's recent history. Somewhere in the village, a poisoner was making final preparations for murder disguised as holiday hospitality. Whether Inspector Slack's investigation would identify and stop them before tragedy occurred remained to be seen. Chapter 5. Inspector Slack investigates the manor kitchen. Inspector Slack arrived at Blackwood Manor shortly after 10 o'clock on the morning of December 20th, his official demeanour firmly in place as he approached the imposing front entrance. He had spent a restless night, considering Miss Marple's concerns and reviewing what little official information existed about Gerald Blackwood's business practices and personal history. The picture that emerged suggested a man who had made numerous enemies over decades of ruthless behaviour, any of whom might harbour murderous intentions. Dorothy Mills answered his knock with the carefully neutral expression of a long-serving domestic who had learned to reveal nothing of her thoughts or feelings to visitors. She appeared even more drawn and exhausted than when Miss Marple had observed her several days earlier, dark circles beneath her eyes suggesting inadequate sleep and considerable emotional strain. "Inspector Slack," Mills greeted him with professional courtesy. "May I inquire about the purpose of your visit?" "Mr. Blackwood is quite busy with final preparations for this evening's celebration, and specifically requested that he not be disturbed before absolutely necessary." Slack produced his official identification with practiced authority. "I'm conducting routine safety inspections for all Advent calendar celebrations, Mrs. Mills. Given the large number of guests expected this evening and the potential fire hazards associated with elaborate Christmas decorations, the police department has implemented a policy of preventive checks. I'll need to examine the main entertaining areas, kitchen facilities, and any spaces where electrical lighting or open flames will be utilized." This explanation was entirely fabricated, as no such policy existed, but it provided sufficient official justification to gain access to the manor's interior spaces. Mills accepted it, with obvious reluctance, though she could hardly refuse entry to a police inspector conducting what appeared to be legitimate safety procedures. The manor's interior revealed extensive Christmas decoration that must have required days of effort to complete. Garlands of evergreen boughs adorned every horizontal surface, elaborate wreaths hung in precise intervals along the main corridor, and the drawing room's massive windows displayed nativity scenes that would be visible from the grounds once illuminated for the evening celebration. The overall effect was impressive but somehow cold, demonstrating wealth and precision rather than genuine holiday warmth. Mills led Slack through the public rooms with mechanical efficiency, pointing out fire extinguishers, electrical connections and emergency exits with the thoroughness of someone who had performed similar tours many times before. The inspector noted everything with appropriate attention while actually focusing his observations on Mills herself, watching for any signs of guilty knowledge or nervous behaviour that might confirm Miss Marple's suspicions. It was when they reached the kitchen that Slack's investigation began to yield genuinely concerning discoveries. The large, well-equipped room showed clear evidence of extensive recent activity, with multiple mixing bowls, cooking implements, and chocolate-making equipment arranged on the main work table. More significantly, Slack observed two distinctly separate work areas, one apparently devoted to preparing guest refreshments, and another, smaller space set apart near the pantry door, where a distinctive red tin sat prominently displayed. "That's Mr. Blackwood's private chocolate tin," Mills explained when she noticed the inspector's attention focusing on the red container. "He's most particular about keeping his personal peppermint creams separate from the guest chocolates. Says they're made from his grandmother's recipe and are too special to share with random villagers who wouldn't appreciate the difference between premium confections and common sweets." This casual revelation provided crucial confirmation of what Miss Marple had theorized. Blackwood's possessive attitude toward his personal chocolates created perfect conditions for selective poisoning, ensuring that contaminated confections would affect only the intended victim while leaving guests unharmed. Slack made careful notes while maintaining his facade of conducting routine safety inspection. "I'll need to examine the food storage and preparation areas more thoroughly," he announced, moving toward the pantry before Mills could object. "Fire safety regulations require verification that flammable materials are properly stored away from heat sources." The pantry was extensive, reflecting the manor's substantial size and Blackwood's considerable wealth. Shelves lined with expensive provisions extended along two walls, while a third wall featured locked cabinets that presumably contained more valuable or restricted items. Slack's trained eye immediately noticed fresh scratches around one cabinet's lock, suggesting recent forced entry or manipulation. "Mrs. Mills, who has keys to these locked cabinets?" he inquired, maintaining his casual tone despite his heightened alertness. "Only Mr. Blackwood and myself," Mills replied, her voice betraying the first hint of nervousness since Slack's arrival. "The cabinets contain silver serving pieces and expensive china that Mr. Blackwood prefers to keep secured when not in use." "I see. And have you noticed any signs of unauthorized access to these cabinets recently? These scratches around the lock appear quite fresh." Mills's hesitation before responding told Slack everything he needed to know about her awareness that something irregular had occurred. I I did notice those scratches yesterday evening, Inspector. I mentioned them to Mr. Blackwood, but he dismissed my concern, saying the damage was probably old and I simply hadn't observed it earlier. Slack examined the lock more closely with a magnifying glass he produced from his coat pocket. The scratches were definitely fresh, created within the past few days by someone attempting to pick or force the lock without leaving obvious evidence of their intrusion. He made additional notes, his suspicions now thoroughly aroused by this discovery combined with everything else Miss Marple had reported. It was at this moment that Gerald Blackwood himself appeared in the kitchen doorway, his expression transitioning from surprise to anger as he observed the inspector examining his pantry cabinets. He was a man of perhaps 65 years, well-dressed and imposing despite his age, with the commanding presence that wealth and authority had cultivated over decades. "Inspector Slack, I was not informed that police would be conducting inspections today," Blackwood said with barely controlled irritation. "Mrs. Mills, why wasn't I notified immediately that we had official visitors?" "My apologies for the inconvenience, Mr. Blackwood," Slack replied with deliberate politeness. "I'm conducting routine safety inspections for this evening's celebration. Several aspects of your food preparation areas require closer examination to ensure compliance with public health and safety regulations." This was another improvisation, as Slack had no actual authority to enforce health regulations, but his official manner and the general public's uncertain knowledge about police jurisdiction created sufficient ambiguity to prevent immediate challenge. Blackwood's face darkened with anger, but he controlled his temper with visible effort. "I see. Well, Inspector, please proceed with whatever examinations you deem necessary, so we can complete this inconvenience as quickly as possible. I have extensive preparations remaining before this evening's guests arrive." Slack seized this opportunity to press his investigation further. "Mr. Blackwood, I understand you've been preparing homemade chocolates as refreshments for the celebration. Might I examine your ingredients and preparation methods? Food safety protocols require verification that proper sanitation procedures have been followed when preparing consumables for public distribution." The request clearly angered Blackwood, but refusing a police inspector's direct inquiry about food safety would appear suspicious. He gestured curtly toward the work table where his chocolate-making equipment remained arranged. "As you can see, Inspector, everything has been prepared according to proper culinary standards. The ingredients are premium quality, the equipment has been thoroughly cleaned, and the chocolates themselves have been stored at appropriate temperatures to maintain freshness." Slack examined the various bowls, implements, and ingredient containers with methodical attention, noting that Blackwood's work area included several substances that seemed unnecessary for basic chocolate making. Most notably, he observed a small glass bottle containing clear liquid tucked partially behind a canister of cocoa powder. The bottle bore no label, which immediately raised suspicions about its contents and purpose. "Mr. Blackwood, could you identify this unlabeled bottle for me?" Slack inquired, carefully lifting the container to examine it more closely. "Safety regulations prohibit the storage of unidentified substances in food preparation areas." Blackwood's reaction to this question provided the first genuine crack in his composed facade. His face paled slightly, and his hands clenched briefly before he regained control of his expression. "That's merely vanilla extract, Inspector. The label must have fallen off during preparation. Perfectly ordinary baking ingredient." Slack uncapped the bottle and cautiously sniffed its contents, immediately detecting an acrid chemical odour that bore no resemblance to vanilla extract. His police training included basic familiarity with common poisons, and while he could not definitively identify the substance without laboratory analysis, its smell and appearance suggested something far more sinister than ordinary baking ingredients. "Mr. Blackwood, I'm afraid I'll need to confiscate this bottle for laboratory testing," Slack announced, producing an evidence bag from his coat pocket. "Unlabeled chemicals in food preparation areas represent serious safety violations that require official investigation regardless of your explanation about vanilla extract." The atmosphere in the kitchen had transformed from uncomfortable to openly hostile. Blackwood's anger was now barely contained, while Dorothy Mills had gone very pale and was gripping the edge of the work table as though needing physical support. Slack observed both reactions with professional interest, recognizing that his investigation had touched upon something significant. "This is outrageous," Blackwood protested. "You have no authority to confiscate my property based on absurd speculation about mislabeled vanilla extract. I'll be contacting my solicitors immediately about this harassment." "You're certainly welcome to do so, Mr. Blackwood," Slack replied with unshaken composure. "However, public safety takes precedence over personal convenience, and I'm exercising my authority to investigate potential hazards in a venue where 60 or 70 villagers will be gathering this evening. If laboratory analysis confirms your claim that this is vanilla extract, the substance will be returned with appropriate apologies. If it proves to be something else, we'll proceed accordingly." He secured the bottle carefully in his evidence bag and prepared to complete his inspection of the remaining kitchen areas. Before he could continue, however, Dorothy Mills suddenly spoke in a voice that trembled with barely suppressed emotion. "Inspector, I must speak with you privately. There are matters regarding this household that require official attention." Blackwood's face transformed from angry to furious. "Mrs. Mills, you will say nothing further without my express permission. As my employee, you have obligations of confidentiality and loyalty that supersede any impulse to gossip with police officers about matters that don't concern them." Slack intervened immediately, recognizing that Mills was attempting to provide crucial information despite obvious fear of her employer's reaction. "Mr. Blackwood, Mrs. Mills has every right to speak with police officers if she has information relevant to public safety or criminal activity. Any attempt to prevent her from doing so would itself constitute an offence. Mrs. Mills, please accompany me to somewhere we can speak privately." The confrontation had reached a crisis point that would determine whether Slack's investigation uncovered the truth before evening's celebration, or whether the poisoner, whoever they might be, succeeded in their deadly plans. As Dorothy Mills followed him toward the manor's entrance hall, Slack reflected that Miss Marple's concerns were proving far more substantial than he had initially credited. Chapter 6. The housekeeper's 32-year burden revealed. Inspector Slack led Dorothy Mills to the manor's small morning room, a relatively private space where their conversation would not be overheard by Blackwood or interrupted by other staff. The housekeeper's composure was clearly deteriorating, her hands shaking as she seated herself in one of the room's stiff-backed chairs, her face reflecting decades of suppressed emotion now threatening to surface. "Mrs. Mills," Slack began with uncharacteristic gentleness, recognizing that he was dealing with a woman under extreme psychological strain. "Please take your time and tell me whatever you believe I need to know about the situation in this household. Everything you say will be treated with appropriate confidentiality unless it relates to criminal activity or imminent danger." Mills drew a shuddering breath before beginning to speak, her words emerging haltingly as though each sentence required immense effort to articulate. "Inspector, I've served in this house for 32 years, ever since my husband's death in 1920. What you may not know is that Richard, my husband, was Gerald Blackwood's business partner, and his death was no accident." This confirmation of what Miss Marple had suspected provided crucial foundation for understanding Mills's potential motive. Slack made careful notes while encouraging Mills to continue with her account. Richard and Gerald had argued that morning about financial discrepancies in their business accounts, Mills explained, her voice growing steadier as she recounted the long-buried details. Richard had discovered that Gerald was systematically embezzling from their partnership, falsifying records to hide his theft. He threatened to report Gerald to the authorities unless the stolen funds were returned immediately. "And what happened? During this confrontation?" Slack prompted gently. "I wasn't present for the argument itself, but witnesses working at the warehouse reported hearing violent shouting, then a crash, and Richard's scream as he fell down the stairs. When the police investigated, Gerald claimed Richard had simply lost his footing during a heated discussion, that the fall was entirely accidental despite the unfortunate timing. The investigators accepted his version, influenced by his wealth and social position, and the death was officially ruled accidental." Mills's hands clenched in her lap, knuckles white with the force of emotion she was struggling to contain. "I knew better, Inspector. I knew Gerald had pushed Richard deliberately, had murdered him to prevent exposure of his financial crimes. But I had no proof beyond my certainty, and who would believe a newly widowed woman's accusations against one of the district's wealthiest men?" "So you accepted employment as his housekeeper," Slack observed, understanding the bitter irony of that arrangement. "I had no choice," Mills replied with quiet desperation. "Richard's death left me penniless. Gerald had already stolen everything from our partnership, and without Richard's income I couldn't support myself. When Gerald offered me the housekeeper position, saying he felt obligated to help his former partner's widow, I recognised the offer for what it was. A way to keep me close, to monitor me, and ensure I never spoke publicly about my suspicions regarding Richard's death." The picture Mills was painting explained her decades of service in a household where she believed the master had murdered her husband. Slack found himself feeling genuine sympathy for the housekeeper's terrible situation, while simultaneously recognising that her powerful motive and extensive access to the kitchen made her a prime suspect in the potential poisoning Miss Marple had warned about. "Mrs. Mills, why are you telling me this now, after 32 years of silence?" he asked, watching her face carefully for any indication of guilty knowledge. Mills met his gaze directly, her exhausted eyes showing nothing but profound weariness and resignation. "Because I believe Gerald is planning to kill himself tonight during the Advent celebration, and I cannot allow innocent villagers to be present when it happens, possibly even blamed for his death." This revelation startled Slack considerably, as it suggested a scenario quite different from what Miss Marple had theorised. "Why would you believe Mr. Blackwood intends to commit suicide?" "Because I've been observing him carefully these past weeks, watching as he prepares something I recognise as a final settling of accounts," Mills explained. "He's been reviewing his will repeatedly, meeting with solicitors about estate distributions, and making arrangements that suggest someone preparing for imminent death. More significantly, he's been behaving differently toward me, making comments about justice and payment for old debts, implying that something significant is about to occur." Slack leaned forward with increased attention. "Has Mr. Blackwood made any specific statements suggesting suicidal intentions?" "Not directly, but he's been preparing those chocolates with an intensity that goes far beyond simple hospitality. He's been obsessive about keeping his personal batch separate from the guest chocolates, repeatedly emphasizing that his special peppermint creams are exclusively for his own consumption. And yesterday, he made a strange comment about how the Advent celebration would give him opportunity to demonstrate that some people's suffering cannot be indefinitely ignored." The inspector considered this information carefully, recognizing that it aligned with certain elements of Miss Marple's concerns, while suggesting a different interpretation of Blackwood's behaviour. "Mrs. Mills, have you observed Mr. Blackwood handling any unusual substances during his chocolate preparation? Anything that might be toxic or dangerous if consumed?" Mills hesitated before responding, clearly wrestling with conflicting loyalties, despite her earlier decision to speak with Slack. I discovered an empty tin of vintage rat poison in the dustbin 2 days ago. The label indicated it contained thallium sulfate, which I know is extremely poisonous to humans. When I asked Gerald about it, he became angry and told me to mind my own business, that he was disposing of hazardous materials found in the outbuildings, and my questions were unwelcome interference. "But you suspect he used some portion of that poison for purposes other than disposal," Slack said, understanding the implication. "I'm certain of it," Mills confirmed. "The tin was approximately half full when I last saw it stored in the garden shed several months ago. If Gerald were simply disposing of it, he would have thrown away the entire container intact. Finding it empty in the dustbin suggests he removed the contents for some specific purpose." This was precisely the sort of evidence Slack needed to justify more aggressive intervention. He made extensive notes while considering his next questions carefully. "Mrs. Mills, do you have any direct knowledge of how Mr. Blackwood might have incorporated thallium into the chocolates? Did you observe him adding any substances to the chocolate mixture beyond normal baking ingredients?" Mills shook her head. "Gerald has been extremely secretive about his chocolate preparation, ordering me out of the kitchen whenever he's working with the peppermint creams. I have no direct evidence of what he's done, only my observations of his behaviour and the circumstantial evidence of the empty poison container. And the unlabelled bottle that I confiscated earlier, do you know what that substance actually is?" "I've never seen that bottle before this morning," Mills replied. "Gerald must have brought it into the kitchen overnight, as it wasn't present yesterday evening when I completed my final cleaning." Slack considered whether Mills was being entirely truthful, or whether she might be deflecting suspicion from herself by suggesting Blackwood's suicidal intentions. Her account was plausible, yet it also provided convenient cover if she herself had been the one to poison the chocolates. He decided to press more directly on this possibility. "Mrs. Mills, I must ask you directly, have you tampered with Mr. Blackwood's chocolates in any way? Given your history with him and your belief that he murdered your husband, you would certainly have powerful motive to seek revenge through poisoning." Mills's response was immediate and emphatic. "No, Inspector, I have not. 32 years I've lived with the knowledge that Gerald murdered Richard and escaped justice. 32 years I've endured serving the man who destroyed my life. If I had wanted revenge through poison, I've had countless opportunities over 3 decades to accomplish it without requiring elaborate preparations or public displays." This logic was sound, Slack had to admit. Mills's prolonged access to Blackwood's food and drink throughout their decades of shared household would have provided unlimited opportunities for poisoning if revenge had been her primary motivation. The specific circumstances of the Advent celebration seemed unnecessarily complicated if Mills were the would-be poisoner. "Very well, Mrs. Mills, I'm going to ask you to remain available for further questioning, and to not discuss this conversation with anyone, including Mr. Blackwood, until I've completed my investigation. Do I have your cooperation on these points?" "Yes, Inspector," Mills agreed, seeming relieved to have finally unburdened herself of information she had clearly been struggling to contain. "I simply want to prevent whatever tragedy Gerald is planning. The Advent calendar tradition should bring joy to the village, not become the stage for his final manipulation of everyone around him." After Mills departed to resume her duties, Slack remained in the morning room for several minutes, reviewing his notes and considering the complex situation that had emerged. He now had confirmation that thallium poison had been present at Blackwood Manor, that the manor's owner had been behaving strangely in ways consistent with either suicidal planning or elaborate deception, and that multiple people with powerful motives had access to the kitchen during the crucial chocolate preparation period. The investigation was far from complete, but Slack recognized that he had uncovered sufficient evidence to justify cancelling the evening's celebration until laboratory analysis could confirm the contents of the confiscated bottle and determine whether the chocolates themselves contained toxic substances. He needed to speak with Miss Marple again, to share what he had learned and solicit her insights about which interpretation of the evidence seemed most consistent with human nature and psychological probability. Chapter 7. Poison identified in the private chocolate tin. Inspector Slack departed Blackwood Manor shortly before noon, the confiscated bottle secured carefully in his evidence bag, along with detailed notes from his conversation with Dorothy Mills. His first priority was arranging immediate laboratory analysis of the bottle's contents, even if such testing might require expedited procedures that would prove expensive for the police department's limited budget. The potential for mass poisoning at the evening's celebration justified whatever costs might be incurred. Dr. Haydock proved invaluable in this regard, as his medical connections included a colleague at the county hospital who specialized in toxicology and maintained a well-equipped laboratory capable of conducting rapid analysis when circumstances demanded. By early afternoon, Slack had delivered the bottle to the hospital and impressed upon the toxicologist the urgency of testing its contents before evening's Advent celebration. While awaiting these results, Slack proceeded to interview the other suspects that Miss Marple had identified. Thomas Reed was located at his modest office in the village centre, where he was reviewing final arrangements for the evening's celebration, despite growing doubts about whether the event would proceed as scheduled. "Mr. Reed," Slack began after the usual formalities had been observed, "I need to ask you several questions about your visits to Blackwood Manor during the past week. Specifically, I need to know whether you had access to the kitchen during any of these visits, and whether you observed anything unusual about Mr. Blackwood's behaviour or the food preparation activities." Reed appeared genuinely surprised by this line of inquiry. "Inspector, I've been to the manor 3 or 4 times over the past 10 days, coordinating arrangements and ensuring all celebration details meet the Women's Institute's requirements. I did pass through the kitchen on several occasions, primarily to discuss service arrangements with Mrs. Mills, but I certainly didn't interfere with any food preparation. Did you notice Mr. Blackwood's red tin of private chocolates during these visits?" "Yes, he was quite emphatic about keeping those separate from guest refreshments," Reed confirmed. "Made several pointed comments about how his special peppermint creams were too good for common villagers, who wouldn't appreciate quality confections. Rather offensive attitude, actually, though I suppose consistent with his general character. Slack noted Reed's evident dislike of Blackwood before proceeding to more sensitive questions. "Mr. Reed, I understand your family lost their farm several years ago due to foreclosure by Blackwood's bank. That must have created considerable animosity toward him." Reed's expression hardened. "Indeed it did, Inspector. My father devoted his entire life to that farm, and Blackwood destroyed him through deliberate fraud. But if you're suggesting I might have poisoned the man's chocolates, you're quite wrong. I despise Gerald Blackwood, but I'm not a murderer." "Where were you on the evening of December 17th between 7 and 9 o'clock?" Slack asked, aware this was the time frame when Mills had reported being absent from the kitchen. "At a Women's Institute committee meeting at Mrs. Bantry's residence," Reed replied immediately. "We were discussing final arrangements for the December 22nd celebration. Mrs. Bantry and at least 6 other committee members can confirm my presence throughout that evening." This alibi, if verified, would eliminate Reed from consideration for certain time frames when poisoning might have occurred. Slack made careful notes before moving to interview Sarah Fletcher, whose catering business had been deliberately destroyed by Blackwood 3 years earlier. Fletcher received him at her commercial kitchen, a modest but meticulously clean facility that spoke to her professional standards and dedication to rebuilding her ruined reputation. Her response to Slack's questions was direct and uncompromising. "Inspector, I won't pretend I don't hate Gerald Blackwood. He destroyed my business through calculated cruelty, and rebuilding from that destruction required years of work and sacrifice. But I would never resort to poison, particularly not in circumstances that might endanger innocent guests at a community celebration." "Yet you had access to Blackwood Manor's kitchen on December 17th, Slack pressed, when you retrieved your stored serving dishes. That would have provided opportunity to tamper with chocolate preparations." "Yes, I was at the manor that afternoon," Fletcher admitted, "but I was accompanied throughout my visit by Mrs. Mills, who helped me locate the stored items. I was never alone in the kitchen, or any other area where I might have accessed Blackwood's private chocolates without being observed." This detail, if confirmed by Mills, would significantly reduce Fletcher's viability as a suspect. Slack proceeded to Harold Price's photography studio, where he found the village photographer organising prints from recent assignments, including his documentation of Blackwood Manor's Christmas decorations. Price's interview revealed similar patterns: strong motive rooted in legitimate grievance against Blackwood, access to the manor during the crucial time period, but credible explanations for his movements and activities that made actual poisoning seem logistically difficult. His access to the kitchen had been brief and partially supervised, occurring while he photographed various areas of the manor for the village newsletter. The final suspect interview involved Catherine Blackwood, Gerald's estranged sister, whose bitter confrontation with her brother on December 18th had been witnessed by multiple servants and groundskeepers. Slack found her at the modest cottage where she lived and worked, giving piano lessons to village children to support herself. Catherine made no attempt to conceal her hatred for her brother, or her belief that he deserved whatever misfortune might befall him. "Gerald stole my inheritance through fraud and forgery, Inspector. He condemned me to poverty while living in the manor that should have been shared between us. If he's poisoned himself with his own arrogance and greed, I'll not shed tears at his funeral." "So, you admit you wished him dead," Slack observed, noting her vehemence. "Wishing and acting are quite different things, Inspector. Yes, I've wished Gerald dead for 37 years. But I'm not foolish enough to poison him in circumstances that would immediately focus suspicion on his limited number of enemies. If I were to commit murder, which I'm not, I would be considerably more subtle in my methods." This frank acknowledgement of homicidal wishes, combined with logical explanation of why she wouldn't act on them, presented the same pattern Slack had observed in the other suspect interviews. Everyone had motive and some degree of access, yet none of them quite fit the profile of someone who would execute this particular poisoning plot in these specific circumstances. It was late afternoon when Slack finally received the telephone call he had been awaiting from the hospital toxicology laboratory. The news confirmed his worst fears while simultaneously clarifying certain aspects of the investigation. "Inspector, the substance in that bottle is definitely not vanilla extract," the toxicologist reported. "It's a concentrated solution of thallium sulfate, approximately 10 times the lethal dose if consumed in the quantity that bottle contains. Whoever prepared this solution knew exactly what they were doing and intended to create something potently deadly. Slack thanked the toxicologist and immediately placed a call to Blackwood Manor, informing Dorothy Mills that the evening's Advent celebration was cancelled by police order and that no one should consume any of the prepared chocolates under any circumstances. He then contacted Miss Marple to report his findings and request her presence at an emergency meeting at the village police station. Miss Marple arrived within 20 minutes, accompanied by Mrs. Bantry and Dr. Haydock, all three clearly alarmed by the urgency of Slack's summons. The inspector briefed them on his day's investigations, including Dorothy Mills's revelations about her husband's murder and Blackwood's suspicious behaviour, the interviews with other suspects, and finally the laboratory confirmation that the confiscated bottle contained lethal poison. The question now, Slack concluded, is whether we're dealing with attempted suicide or attempted murder. Mrs. Mills believes Blackwood intends to poison himself during the celebration, using the Advent calendar tradition as a theatrical backdrop for his final exit. But we can't rule out the possibility that someone else prepared that poison solution and planned to substitute it for legitimate ingredients in Blackwood's private chocolates. Miss Marple had listened to this summary with her characteristic quiet attention, her knitting needles moving steadily as her mind processed the various elements of the case. When Slack finished, she set aside her knitting and spoke with calm certainty. "Inspector, I believe we must consider a third possibility that encompasses elements of both theories. What if Gerald Blackwood discovered that someone was planning to poison him, and rather than report the plot to authorities, he's deliberately allowing it to proceed for reasons of his own?" This interpretation had not occurred to Slack, and he found himself intrigued by its logical consistency with certain observed facts. What would motivate someone to allow their own murder? Guilt, perhaps, Miss Marple suggested, or a desire for revenge that extends beyond his own death, ensuring that his murderer faces justice while he achieves a form of martyrdom. Mr. Blackwood has harmed many people over his lifetime. Perhaps he's reached a point where he recognizes that his accumulated sins demand payment, yet his pride prevents him from simply confessing and making restitution. Allowing himself to be murdered while ensuring his killer is caught might appeal to someone with his particular psychology. Dr. Haydock nodded thoughtfully. That would explain his strange behaviour that Mrs. Mills described, the comments about justice and payment for old debts. He might be orchestrating his own death while simultaneously arranging to punish whoever is attempting to kill him. But how would he ensure his murderer faces justice, Mrs. Bantry inquired. If he's dead, he can't testify about who poisoned him. No, Miss Marple agreed. But he could arrange circumstances so that evidence clearly points to the guilty party. The Advent celebration provides ideal conditions for such a plan, with witnesses present to observe who had final access to the chocolates, whose behaviour might reveal guilty knowledge, and so forth. Slack considered this theory carefully, recognising its disturbing plausibility. If you're correct, Miss Marple, then we must still determine who actually prepared the poison and intended to use it. Even if Blackwood is allowing or even encouraging his own murder, the person who carries it out is still guilty of homicide. Precisely, Miss Marple confirmed, and I believe the evidence properly examined will reveal which of our suspects possesses not merely motive and opportunity, but also the specific knowledge and capability required to execute this particular form of poisoning. Chapter 8. The celebration proceeds under police observation. Despite Inspector Slack's strong preference to cancel the December 20th Advent celebration entirely, circumstances and competing considerations made outright cancellation impractical. Gerald Blackwood had refused to cooperate with police recommendations, insisting that the celebration would proceed as scheduled regardless of official concerns about public safety. Moreover, Slack recognised that forcing cancellation might drive the poisoning plot underground, preventing the very observation and evidence gathering that Miss Marple had suggested might reveal the guilty party. After extensive consultation with Miss Marple, Dr. Haydock, and his superiors at County Police Headquarters, Slack arrived at a compromise solution. The celebration would proceed, but under strict police supervision, with plainclothes officers stationed throughout Blackwood Manor to observe all activities and intervene immediately if any attempt was made to consume the suspected poisoned chocolates. Additionally, Slack arranged for the chocolates in Blackwood's private red tin to be secretly analysed before the celebration. This was accomplished through Dorothy Mills's cooperation during the late afternoon, when Blackwood was occupied with other preparations. Mills provided access to the kitchen, allowing a police chemist to extract small samples from 3 randomly selected peppermint creams in the private tin. The laboratory analysis, conducted with extreme urgency at the county hospital, confirmed what Slack and Miss Marple had suspected. All 3 samples contained lethal concentrations of thallium sulfate, carefully incorporated into the chocolate in ways that would be completely undetectable to taste or visual inspection. Whoever had poisoned these chocolates had possessed both chemical knowledge and technical skill to create confections that would deliver fatal doses while appearing entirely normal. By 7 o'clock on December 20th, approximately 60 villagers had assembled in the grounds of Blackwood Manor, their breath forming clouds in the cold winter air as they waited for the official beginning of the Advent celebration. The manor's exterior displayed elaborate Christmas illumination that transformed the Georgian facade into a glowing beacon visible from significant distance, while the drawing room's tall windows revealed the promised nativity scene in spectacular detail. Miss Marple had positioned herself strategically near the manor's main entrance, where she could observe arrivals and departures, while maintaining the appearance of an elderly lady simply enjoying the community gathering. She noted with particular interest which suspects attended, and where they positioned themselves relative to Blackwood and the refreshment areas. Dorothy Mills appeared briefly to welcome early arrivals before retreating to the kitchen to assist with final preparations, her face still showing signs of the strain that had characterized her appearance throughout the past week. Thomas Reed moved efficiently among the crowd, fulfilling his professional obligations as event coordinator, despite his personal animosity toward the celebration's host. Sarah Fletcher had chosen to attend despite her displacement as caterer, perhaps from curiosity about what Blackwood had prepared to replace her services. Harold Price circulated with his camera, documenting the celebration for the village newsletter with the same thoroughness he had applied to his earlier photography of the manor's decorations. Catherine Blackwood stood apart from the main crowd, her expression reflecting bitter resentment as she observed the manor's splendour and the community celebration of her brother's hospitality. At precisely 7:15, Gerald Blackwood emerged from the manor's front entrance to formally welcome his guests. He appeared in excellent health and spirits, showing no signs of distress or suicidal intention. His brief speech emphasized the importance of community tradition and his pleasure in hosting the 20th window of St. Mary Mead's Living Advent calendar, though Miss Marple detected an undercurrent of mockery in his tone that suggested he was enjoying some private joke at the gathering's expense. "My friends and neighbours," Blackwood concluded with theatrical warmth that fooled no one familiar with his true character, "I invite you to view the nativity scene I have prepared in the drawing room, and to enjoy the refreshments I have personally prepared as my contribution to our beloved Advent tradition. For most of you, I have procured the finest chocolates London's premier chocolatier can provide. But for myself," he produced the red tin with evident pride, "I have prepared my grandmother's famous peppermint creams using her original recipe. These are far too precious to share, I'm afraid, but I look forward to enjoying them while you sample the guest chocolates." This brazen emphasis on keeping his private chocolates separate from guest refreshments sent a clear signal to everyone present that Blackwood understood exactly what was happening. Miss Marple observed the reactions of her 5 suspects with keen attention, noting that Dorothy Mills had gone very pale at Blackwood's words, while Catherine Blackwood's expression showed grim satisfaction rather than concern. The guests filed into the manor's drawing room, where the nativity scene exceeded even the most optimistic expectations. Elaborate figurines arranged in front of the window created a 3-dimensional tableau that appeared almost alive in the flickering candlelight, while recorded music of traditional carols provided atmospheric accompaniment. The guest chocolates were displayed on silver trays near the window, accessible to anyone who wished to sample them, while Blackwood kept his red tin of peppermint creams prominently positioned on a small side table where everyone could observe that he alone would consume their contents. Inspector Slack, dressed in civilian clothing to avoid alarming the guests, maintained his position near the refreshment area, while his 2 plainclothes constables monitored the crowd from other vantage points. The plan was to observe Blackwood's behaviour carefully, document any attempted consumption of the poisoned, chocolates, and intervene before fatal doses could be ingested. For 20 minutes, the celebration proceeded normally. Guests admired the nativity scene, praised Blackwood's hospitality with varying degrees of sincerity, and sampled the guest chocolates, which proved to be of exceptional quality. Blackwood circulated among the crowd with evident satisfaction, accepting compliments and playing the role of gracious host with the theatrical skill that characterized his entire approach to this event. It was at 7:35 that Blackwood made his move. He returned to the side table where his red tin sat waiting, opened it with deliberate ceremony, and selected several peppermint creams while announcing to the nearby guests that he was about to enjoy his private supply of superior confections. Miss Marple watched this performance with absolute certainty that Blackwood knew exactly what those chocolates contained and precisely what consuming them would accomplish. "Ladies and gentlemen," Blackwood announced, holding up one of the peppermint creams for everyone to observe, "I invite you to witness that some pleasures are worth keeping to oneself. These peppermint creams represent the finest chocolate craftsmanship, far superior to the adequate but unremarkable confections I've provided for general consumption." The arrogance and cruelty of this statement were entirely consistent with Blackwood's character. Yet Miss Marple detected something deeper in his words, a final assertion of the superiority and selfishness that had characterized his entire life. He was creating a memorable scene that would ensure everyone present remembered his possessive attitude toward those specific chocolates. Before Blackwood could actually consume any of the peppermint creams, Inspector Slack intervened with swift authority. "Mr. Blackwood, please do not eat those chocolates. I have reason to believe they contain lethal poison." The dramatic announcement created immediate chaos in the drawing room. Guests gasped and stepped back from Blackwood and the red tin, while the 5 suspects displayed reactions that Miss Marple observed with careful attention. Dorothy Mills appeared relieved rather than surprised. Thomas Reed looked shocked, but somehow vindicated. Sarah Fletcher showed professional concern mixed with grim satisfaction. Harold Price seemed primarily confused by this disruption of the celebration he was photographing, and Catherine Blackwood displayed an expression that might have been disappointment that her brother's dramatic moment had been interrupted. Blackwood's own reaction was most revealing. Rather than appearing surprised or grateful for the intervention, he showed anger and frustration, as though Slack had ruined a carefully orchestrated performance. "Inspector, this is absurd. These chocolates are perfectly safe. I prepared them myself using ingredients I personally selected and stored." Laboratory analysis confirms that the chocolates in this tin contain lethal concentrations of thallium sulfate, Slack replied firmly, producing the analytical results from his coat pocket. "Someone has poisoned these confections, Mr. Blackwood, whether with your knowledge or without it. I cannot allow you to consume them under any circumstances." The admission that the chocolates were indeed poisoned sent fresh waves of shock through the assembled guests. Miss Marple observed that Dorothy Mills had sat down abruptly, her face drained of colour, while Catherine Blackwood remained standing, her expression now revealing calculation rather than emotion. It was at this crucial moment that Miss Marple made her move, rising from her position near the window and approaching Inspector Slack with quiet determination. "Inspector, I believe I can identify who poisoned those chocolates, and more importantly, why they chose this particular method and timing. May I address the gathering?" Slack, recognizing that Miss Marple's insights had proven invaluable throughout the investigation, agreed immediately. The elderly lady moved to a central position where all guests could see and hear her clearly, her demeanor as composed as though she were presenting at a Women's Institute meeting, rather than exposing a murderer before 60 witnesses. Chapter 9. Miss Marple reveals the poisoner's identity. The drawing room at Blackwood Manor fell into expectant silence as Miss Marple prepared to speak, her small figure commanding attention through sheer force of moral authority and demonstrated wisdom. Inspector Slack positioned himself strategically to prevent anyone from leaving before the explanation was complete, while his constables maintained vigilant observation of the 5 suspects. "My dear friends," Miss Marple began in her gentle but clear voice, "we have gathered this evening to celebrate the 20th window of our beloved Advent calendar tradition, meant to build joyful anticipation toward Christmas. Instead, we find ourselves confronting attempted murder, disguised as holiday hospitality. To understand how such corruption of innocent tradition occurred, we must first examine the nature of revenge and the terrible patience it sometimes requires. She paused to ensure her audience was following her reasoning, her keen eyes moving across the faces of those assembled. Gerald Blackwood has spent his life accumulating enemies through cruelty, fraud, and exploitation. Any of the 5 people I will name had powerful motive to wish him dead. Dorothy Mills, whose husband was murdered by Blackwood 32 years ago. Thomas Reed, whose family lost their farm through Blackwood's deliberate fraud. Sarah Fletcher, whose business was deliberately destroyed. Harold Price, whose daughter nearly died after Blackwood broke her engagement through manipulation. And Catherine Blackwood, systematically cheated of her rightful inheritance. Each had motive, and each had some access to Blackwood Manor's kitchen during the period when chocolates were being prepared. Dorothy Mills had begun to weep quietly, while the other named suspects maintained various expressions of tension and apprehension. Blackwood himself watched Miss Marple with evident fascination, as though curious to see how she would resolve the puzzle. The critical question, Miss Marple continued, was not merely who had motive and opportunity, but who possessed the specific knowledge and capability required to execute this particular poisoning. Thallium is not a common substance. Its use as a murder weapon demands understanding of dosage, preparation methods, and the delayed symptom patterns that make it an effective tool for those seeking to establish alibis before their victim dies. She moved closer to the refreshment table where the red tin of poisoned chocolates sat as evidence of malicious intent. Someone with access to vintage rat poison containing thallium sulfate removed the substance and carefully incorporated it into chocolate confections, knowing that Gerald Blackwood's possessive nature would ensure he alone consumed the poisoned batch. This level of planning required intimate knowledge of Blackwood's habits, his household routines, and his psychological character. Inspector Slack's investigation revealed that all 5 suspects had alibis or explanations for their movements during crucial periods when poisoning might have occurred. Yet one person had completely unrestricted access throughout every phase of chocolate preparation: Dorothy Mills, who manages this household and knows its routines better than anyone except Blackwood himself. Mills looked up sharply, her tear-stained face showing resignation rather than denial. "Miss Marple, you're quite right about my access and opportunity. I won't pretend I haven't thought about poisoning Gerald Blackwood almost every day for 32 years. But I didn't act on those thoughts. I didn't poison those chocolates." "No," Miss Marple agreed gently, "you did not. Because despite your powerful motive and perfect opportunity, you lack the essential element that would have driven you to act precisely now rather than at any point during the previous 3 decades. The timing of this poisoning attempt is crucial to identifying the true culprit." She turned to face Catherine Blackwood directly. "Miss Blackwood, your visit to the manor on December 18th was not primarily about demanding your inheritance, was it? It was about ensuring that your carefully prepared poison was properly positioned where your brother would find and consume it, while creating the appearance that your brief kitchen access was coincidental to your confrontation about financial matters." Catherine's face remained impassive, but Miss Marple detected the slight tension around her eyes that suggested heightened alertness. "Your accusation is absurd, Miss Marple. I had barely 10 minutes in this house, most of it spent arguing with Gerald in his study. When would I have had time to poison? Chocolates?" "You didn't poison them during that visit," Miss Marple explained patiently. "You poisoned them earlier, during the weeks of preparation, when your brother first announced his participation in the Advent calendar tradition. You realized this celebration provided perfect opportunity. Witnesses to observe Gerald's possessive attitude toward his private chocolates, a community gathering to deflect suspicion across multiple suspects, and symbolic revenge delivered through the very tradition meant to celebrate community and joy." Miss Marple produced from her reticule a small photograph that Harold Price had taken during his documentation of the manor's Christmas decorations on December 16th. Mr. Price's photographs inadvertently captured crucial evidence. This image, taken in the kitchen, shows the red tin of private chocolates on a shelf. If you examine it closely with a magnifying glass, you can see that the tin's lid is slightly askew, exactly as one might expect if someone had recently opened it to replace its contents with poisoned substitutes. Inspector Slack examined the photograph with professional interest, confirming that the lid's positioning did indeed suggest recent disturbance. "Miss Blackwood, how do you explain this evidence?" Before Catherine could respond, however, Gerald Blackwood himself interrupted with unexpected laughter. "Oh, this is delicious. Miss Marple, you've almost worked out the truth, but not quite completely. Catherine didn't poison those chocolates because I poisoned them myself." This revelation created absolute silence in the drawing room. Every eye turned to Blackwood, whose expression now showed triumphant amusement, rather than the fear or anger one might expect from a poisoning victim. Miss Marple observed him with calm certainty, as though she had been expecting precisely this confession. "I prepared 2 batches of peppermint creams," Blackwood continued with evident satisfaction. "One batch, safe and delicious, which I intended to consume privately in my study. The other batch, carefully poisoned with thallium sulfate from the vintage rat poison I found in the garden shed, which I placed in the red tin specifically to tempt whoever might be planning to kill me. You see, I discovered weeks ago that someone was attempting to murder me through poisoned food, and rather than report it to the authorities, I decided to turn the tables on my would-be assassin." Inspector Slack stepped forward immediately. "Mr. Blackwood, are you confessing to deliberately creating poisoned chocolates with intent to harm whoever might attempt to poison you? That itself constitutes a serious crime." "Oh, I doubt any jury would convict me for setting a trap for my own murderer," Blackwood replied with undiminished amusement. "But the truly delicious irony is that I knew exactly who was planning to poison me, and I arranged circumstances to ensure she would be caught in the act. Dorothy Mills has been slowly poisoning my regular medications for the past month, replacing my heart tablets with substances designed to gradually weaken me before delivering a final fatal dose during the Advent celebration." All attention shifted to Mills, who had gone deathly pale at this accusation. Miss Marple watched the housekeeper's face carefully, seeing not guilt but horror and dawning realization of how thoroughly she had been manipulated. "That's not true," Mills whispered. "I never touched your medications, Gerald." "I would never—" "Of course you would," Blackwood interrupted. 32 years you've served me, knowing I murdered your husband. Do you think I didn't understand what that knowledge would eventually drive you to attempt? I've been waiting for you to act, and when you finally did, I prepared this theatrical revelation to expose you before the entire village and ensure you spend your remaining years in prison, suffering as you've made me suffer through your silent accusations and moral superiority." Miss Marple raised her hand for silence, her expression now showing the sternness that appeared only when confronting genuine wickedness. "Mr. Blackwood, your performance is impressive but ultimately unconvincing. You've created an elaborate fiction designed to frame Dorothy Mills for attempted murder while disguising your own suicidal intentions. The truth, as I understand it, is considerably more complex and infinitely more tragic." She turned to address the assembled guests, many of whom appeared thoroughly confused by the contradictory accusations flying back and forth. What we're witnessing is the final act in Gerald Blackwood's lifetime of manipulation and cruelty. He did indeed poison those chocolates himself, but not to trap a would-be murderer. He poisoned them because he intended to consume them publicly, die dramatically before witnesses, and ensure that Dorothy Mills would be convicted of his murder, despite being entirely innocent. "That's absurd," Blackwood protested, though his voice now carried an undertone of uncertainty. "Why would I poison myself?" "Because you're dying anyway," Miss Marple replied with quiet certainty, "from some disease that modern medicine cannot cure. Dr. Haydock, would you care to confirm my observation that Mr. Blackwood displays several symptoms consistent with advanced cancer?" Dr. Haydock stepped forward, his professional demeanour firmly in place. "I'm not at liberty to discuss patient information without consent, but I can confirm that certain physical signs suggest serious illness consistent with Miss Marple's theory. You chose to transform your inevitable death into a final act of revenge against the one person whose silent judgment has haunted you for 32 years, Miss Marple continued. By poisoning yourself during the Advent celebration and arranging evidence to implicate Dorothy Mills, you would achieve multiple objectives, a dramatic exit that ensures you're remembered, punishment for the housekeeper, whose very presence reminded you daily of your unpunished murder, and corruption of the Advent tradition that represents everything good and generous that you've spent your life opposing. The absolute silence that followed this analysis suggested that Miss Marple had touched upon truth that resonated with everyone present, including Blackwood himself. His expression had transformed from triumphant amusement to something darker and more desperate. "Even if your theory were correct," he said slowly, "which I'm not admitting, how would you prove any of it? I could simply consume these chocolates right now and end this ridiculous speculation." "You could," Inspector Slack agreed, "but you won't, because Miss Marple is absolutely correct about your intentions, and now that they've been exposed before 60 witnesses, achieving martyrdom through self-poisoning would accomplish nothing except confirming her analysis. The question now is what charges, if any, should be brought against you for creating poisoned confections with criminal intent, regardless of whether that intent involved harming yourself or framing an innocent woman." Chapter 10. Advent's dark window closed with bitter justice. The aftermath of the December 20th celebration extended well beyond that evening's dramatic confrontation, creating ripples throughout St. Mary Mead that persisted long after the Christmas decorations had been packed away and the Advent calendar framework dismantled. Gerald Blackwood, faced with undeniable exposure of his malicious plan, had ultimately confessed to poisoning the peppermint creams with suicidal intent, while deliberately arranging circumstances to implicate Dorothy Mills in his death. Inspector Slack, in consultation with the county prosecutor, determined that while Blackwood's actions constituted several criminal offences, including creation of poisonous substances with intent to harm and conspiracy to pervert justice, his advanced terminal illness made prosecution impractical. Instead, arrangements were made to confine him to his manor under medical supervision, ensuring he could harm neither himself nor others during his remaining months. Dorothy Mills was fully exonerated of any involvement in the poisoning plot and released from Blackwood's employment with a substantial financial settlement that Inspector Slack had negotiated as condition for not pursuing more aggressive charges against her former employer. She had departed St. Mary Mead shortly after the new year, seeking a fresh start in a location where 32 years of servitude to her husband's murderer would not define her identity. Miss Marple sat in her comfortable cottage on a grey January afternoon, reviewing the case with Mrs. Bantry over tea and seed cake. The Advent calendar tradition had been permanently altered by the events of December 20th, with the Women's Institute voting unanimously to memorialise that date's window as forever dark, representing acknowledgement that even the most innocent traditions could be corrupted by human malice. "I still don't fully understand how you knew Blackwood had poisoned himself," Mrs. Bantry confessed, accepting a second slice of cake with evident appreciation. The evidence seemed to point equally toward Dorothy Mills or Catherine Blackwood or any of the other suspects. Miss Marple smiled gently, setting down her teacup with characteristic precision. The key was recognizing that the poisoning plot was unnecessarily elaborate if the goal was simply to kill Gerald Blackwood. Any of those 5 suspects could have poisoned him quietly at any time over the years, using methods that would never be detected or traced to them. The theatrical nature of the Advent celebration poisoning suggested someone who wanted witnesses, who needed public observation of the crime for purposes beyond simple murder. "But how did you know it was suicide rather than attempted murder?" "Several small details that accumulated into certainty," Miss Marple explained. Blackwood's insistence on complete control over chocolate preparation, his refusal of any assistance, his emphasis on keeping his private chocolates separate from guest refreshments, all suggested someone orchestrating a performance rather than someone simply hosting a celebration. More significantly, his behaviour toward Dorothy Mills indicated someone creating a framework for blame rather than someone innocently preparing refreshments. Mrs. Bantry nodded thoughtfully. And the terminal illness provided the motive for such an elaborate suicide plan. Precisely. When facing inevitable death from disease, Blackwood chose to transform that death into a final act of cruelty and manipulation. He would deny the cancer the satisfaction of killing him quietly, would instead die dramatically on his own terms, and would ensure that the woman whose silent judgment had haunted him for 3 decades faced conviction for murder she didn't commit. The Advent calendar celebration provided perfect staging for this performance. How terribly sad," Mrs. Bantry observed. "Even facing death, he couldn't find any redemption or grace, only more opportunities for cruelty." Miss Marple reflected on this assessment, recognizing its accuracy while simultaneously feeling the profound tragedy that such a life represented. Gerald Blackwood had possessed wealth, position, and opportunities that most people could only dream about, yet he had chosen to devote those advantages to accumulating power through exploitation and suffering through manipulation. His final act had been entirely consistent with everything that preceded it. The legal complications of the case had required several weeks to resolve completely. Inspector Slack had worked diligently to ensure that all 5 innocent suspects were fully cleared of any involvement in the poisoning plot, while simultaneously documenting Blackwood's elaborate scheme for the official record. The confiscated, poisoned chocolates had been destroyed under supervised laboratory conditions, ensuring they could never harm anyone, while the vintage rat-poison tin that had provided the thallium sulfate was disposed of through proper hazardous material protocols. Catherine Blackwood had initiated legal proceedings to claim her rightful inheritance, armed with evidence that Inspector Slack's investigation had uncovered regarding the fraudulent documents Gerald had used to steal her portion of their father's estate. With Gerald's health declining rapidly, and his criminal intentions now documented officially, the courts had moved swiftly to restore Catherine's legal rights and ensure she would receive appropriate compensation for 37 years of unjust deprivation. Thomas Reed, Sarah Fletcher, and Harold Price had each found some measure of closure in the exposure of Blackwood's long pattern of cruelty and fraud. While legal remedies for their specific grievances remained complicated by the passage of time and Gerald's approaching death, Inspector Slack had connected them with solicitors who specialized in recovering damages from fraudulent business practices and deliberate tortious harm. Most significantly for Miss Marple, Dorothy Mills had finally achieved freedom from the burden she had carried for 32 years. The housekeeper's departure from St. Mary Mead had been marked by a gathering of the Women's Institute, where numerous friends and neighbours had expressed their support and admiration for her strength and dignity throughout her ordeal. Mills had accepted their kindness with quiet grace, acknowledging that while the years of servitude could never be restored, the future at least held possibilities beyond serving the man who had murdered her husband. The Advent calendar tradition itself had survived the corruption of December 20th, though permanently altered by the recognition that human malice could infiltrate even the most innocent community celebrations. The Women's Institute had voted to continue the living Advent calendar in future years, but with the 20th window perpetually dark as memorial and warning. The framework in the village square would display 19 illuminated numbers during each December, with the 20th number remaining unlit, as reminder that Advent calendars meant to count down toward Christmas joy could also count down toward darkness if humanity's capacity for revenge and cruelty was not tempered by grace and forgiveness. Miss Marple had reflected extensively on this dimension of the case, recognizing that Gerald Blackwood's terminal illness might have provided opportunity for redemption that he had deliberately rejected. Rather than using his final months to make restitution, seek forgiveness, or acknowledge the harm he had inflicted across decades, he had chosen to inflict additional suffering and transform his death into one final manipulation. Yet even in this darkest aspect of the case, Miss Marple found elements that affirmed her faith in human resilience and capacity for healing. Dorothy Mills had survived 32 years of psychological torment and emerged with her dignity intact, able to forgive, if not forget, and ready to build a life no longer defined by her husband's murder. The other victims of Blackwood's cruelty had found ways to rebuild their lives, despite the devastation he had inflicted, demonstrating that human spirit could recover even from deliberate attempts to destroy it. As January progressed and St. Mary Mead returned to its normal rhythms, the events of December 20th gradually receded into village history, becoming another story that would be recounted in years to come as warning and reminder of how thin the boundary between innocence and corruption could be. The Women's Institute resumed its regular activities, planning for the next year's Advent calendar with increased attention to safety protocols and background verification of all participating households. Gerald Blackwood lingered through February before his illness finally claimed him in mid-March, dying alone in Blackwood Manor, despite the medical staff that Dorothy Mills's settlement had funded for his care. His funeral was attended by only a handful of people, none of whom mourned his passing with genuine grief. The manor and its contents were sold to settle the various legal claims against his estate, with Catherine Blackwood receiving substantial compensation that allowed her to live comfortably for her remaining years. Miss Marple attended the auction of Blackwood Manor's contents, not from any desire to acquire items from the estate, but from curiosity about what objects a man like Gerald Blackwood had accumulated during his lifetime. She noted with interest that his personal possessions revealed surprisingly little about his inner life, consisting mainly of expensive furnishings, valuable artwork, and luxury items that spoke to wealth rather than genuine passion or connection to anything beyond material accumulation. The red tin that had held the poisoned chocolates was not included in the auction, having been destroyed as evidence in a criminal investigation. Miss Marple found herself grateful for this detail, recognizing that some objects carried associations too dark to be rehabilitated through change of ownership or passage of time. The tin would have been forever tainted by its role in Blackwood's malicious scheme, a physical reminder of how ordinary containers could conceal extraordinary evil. As spring arrived in St. Mary Mead, bringing renewal and the familiar rhythms of village life, continuing beyond individual tragedies, Miss Marple reflected on what the case had revealed about human nature and the complex interplay between justice, revenge, and redemption. Gerald Blackwood had spent his life accumulating grievances against him, harming people through deliberate cruelty, until he had created a roster of individuals who had powerful motives to wish him dead. Yet in the end, his death had come not from any of those justified enemies, but from his own hand, transformed through elaborate deception into attempted final cruelty against the one person whose silent judgment had most troubled his conscience. The irony was profound. Surrounded by people who had cause to murder him, Blackwood had murdered himself while trying to frame an innocent woman for the crime. The Advent calendar that should have counted down to Christmas with joy and anticipation had instead counted down to this dark revelation, proving that even the most innocent traditions could be corrupted when human malice found opportunity to express itself. Yet St. Mary Mead had survived this corruption, choosing to memorialize rather than forget, to learn rather than despair, and to continue the tradition with increased awareness of how vigilantly community values must be protected against those who would exploit them. Miss Marple set aside her knitting as the afternoon light began to fade, satisfied that justice, if not perfect, had at least been achieved in the case of death in the Advent calendar. Gerald Blackwood had died by his own hand, rather than achieving his goal of framing Dorothy Mills for murder. The innocent suspects had been cleared, and in some cases compensated for Blackwood's historical cruelties. The Advent calendar tradition would continue, forever altered, but not destroyed by one man's final act of manipulation. As she prepared her evening tea, Miss Marple found herself thinking about the nature of countdown traditions, and how they functioned in human psychology. Advent calendars created anticipation through daily revelation, building toward a greater celebration through accumulated small surprises. December 20th's window had revealed something terrible rather than joyful, yet even this dark revelation had its place in the larger pattern of human experience. The chocolates that Gerald Blackwood had prepared with such malicious care, poisoned with thallium and designed to corrupt the most innocent of Christmas traditions, had been destroyed without harming anyone beyond their creator. The Advent calendar that should have been joyful had become tragic, yet the tradition itself survived to count down toward Christmas in future years, carrying the memory of what had happened but not defined entirely by that darkness. Outside Miss Marple's cottage window, the village of St. Mary Mead settled into evening routines, lights appearing in windows as families gathered for supper and neighbours exchanged greetings in passing. The Advent calendar framework had been dismantled and stored until the following December, when it would be erected again with its permanent reminder that the 20th window would remain forever dark. But surrounding that dark window would be 19 illuminated numbers, representing the community gatherings that had proceeded with genuine joy and fellowship, the families who had shared there, homes and hospitality without malice, and the tradition that had brought neighbours together in shared anticipation of Christmas. One dark window could not erase 19 bright ones, just as one act of malice could not destroy the resilient goodness that characterised St Mary Mead at its best. Miss Marple smiled softly as she sipped her tea, satisfied that while death in the Advent calendar would be remembered as a cautionary tale, it would not be the final word on Advent traditions or Christmas celebrations or human nature's capacity for both cruelty and resilience. The countdown would continue in future years, building anticipation toward joy while acknowledging that darkness existed alongside light, and that vigilance, wisdom, and community solidarity remained essential protections against those who would corrupt even the most innocent traditions for malicious purposes. The evening star appeared above the cottage garden, signalling the transition from day to night, from activity to rest, from revelation to reflection. The case was closed, justice had been imperfectly achieved, and St Mary Mead would remember December 20th while not being defined by it. And that, Miss Marple reflected with quiet satisfaction, was perhaps the best outcome anyone could reasonably expect when death infiltrated the Advent calendar and thallium corrupted the countdown to Christmas.